Wildfires are raging across the West Coast, burning down millions of acres of land and wiping out entire communities. This has put a renewed spotlight on the conversation surrounding climate change and its impact on our planet. Joining us to discuss this and more is former presidential candidate Tom Steyer. He's also a philanthropist and activist. Tom, thank you so much for joining us today.
Madison, it's great to be with you.
So you're in San Francisco. This is personal for you. How has your experience with the fires been?
Well, I think that people throughout California have been experiencing the fires through the incredible amount of ash and particulate matter in the air. So that in San Francisco, a week ago, there was so much of that in the air that literally they had the street lights on at noon. It felt like the sun never rose, and they have been cautioning us for the last week to stay indoors, that it's dangerous, it's hazardous to go outside. Of course, when 3.5 million acres of your state burn, that means that for some Californians, this has been much more than just, a scary atmosphere to be living in. That means their houses are burning down. That means their communities are burning down. And in the case of the first responders, that means they're risking their lives to go out and try to battle 8,000 fires that have burned in the state of California so far this year. This has been something that has touched virtually every Californian, in some significant way. And it says, it really brings home the idea that here we are living the climate crisis as a state. We're experiencing right now. It's not something in the future. It's right here, present with all of us.
So, Tom, what would you say to folks who aren't necessarily familiar with how these wildfires are intrinsically linked with climate change?
I'd say that in this case, it's really obvious, Madison, because we've had record-breaking heat in California at levels which are historic, but almost hard to comprehend. I think we've had the highest recorded heat in history anywhere on the planet in Death Valley this summer in California. But that's Death Valley, so that's a place that sounds like it might be pretty ominous. In San Luis Obispo, which is a seaside college town, it with a Mediterranean climate, it got to 120 degrees last week. So what we're seeing here is extreme heat followed, which sets this state up, and the forest land is a tinderbox, followed by literally thousands of fires that burn, that rage. And so there's no way not to connect the record-breaking heat with the record-breaking fires that follow shortly thereafter.
And we've heard varying responses from public officials on these fires. I'm specifically thinking about the clashes between the president and former Vice President Joe Biden. What do you make of their reactions to the fires so far?
Well, I think Mr. Trump has doubled down on his lies about climate. And I think that is, he's clearly playing politics with the lives of Americans and the future of all Americans, just as he did in the COVID crisis, where it wasn't convenient for him politically to tell the truth and to save American lives. And so, I think that's very consistent with Mr. Trump's behavior in trying to gut environmental regulations and actually to exacerbate and intensify our climate crisis. And conversely, I've talked to Vice President Biden numbers of times about climate. I talked to him backstage at the debates. I've talked to him numbers of times subsequently. He really gets it. He understands this issue. If there's one thing you should know about Joe Biden, it's that he cares about people. When he talked this week about the climate crisis across America, but specifically with regard to these fires on the West Coast, he was talking about people suffering. He was talking about people's houses burning. He was talking in terms of the floods, about people getting flooded out. He gets this intellectually. He understands the science. But more than that, he gets it at a gut level that we're going to have a huge response to this. And the good news is, because he cares about people, that response is going to be a huge job generator, a huge creator of middle-class, good-paying union jobs. And it's going to be a chance for us to clean up the air and water across the country, but particularly in underserved Black and brown neighborhoods. And so it's something where we have somebody who doesn't care about people fundamentally and doesn't tell the truth fundamentally. And now we have a chance to elect somebody who gets the facts, accepts the facts, deals with the facts, and fundamentally, at his core, cares about the American people and will do what he has to do to protect us. And, it couldn't be a bigger difference.
Tom, you mentioned the impact of climate change on Black and brown communities. I want to zero in with you on talking about that a bit more. How does climate change impact people of color, and specifically, how does that intersect with some of the coronavirus health disparities that we've seen in these communities as well?
Well, let's just start. Let's start with the environmental justice aspects of climate. If you go across the United States of America, and I've been traveling as an activist for a decade, what you see is that the air pollution is concentrated in neighborhoods. The asthma associated with it is concentrated in neighborhoods. And those are overwhelmingly Black and brown neighborhoods. And that if you go to the places where you get sick or die from drinking the water, the Flint, Michigans, the Denmark, South Carolinas, the West Fresnos in the Valley in my home state, those are overwhelmingly Black and brown communities. This country has concentrated its toxins and its pollutants in those neighborhoods. And in fixing our climate problem, it is inherent that as we come up with climate policy, we start with leadership from those communities. We start with policies that address those very real environmental injustices. And that's precisely what Joe Biden's climate plan does. And if you look at COVID, Black and brown people across this country disproportionately have gotten exposed to this virus because they are disproportionately essential workers. So they have gone to their jobs, they've been exposed. And in addition, they've disproportionately suffered from it because of pre-existing conditions based on other historic injustices. When we look across this country in the natural world and we look at environmentalism, the people suffering from environmental ruination, from environmental problems, are disproportionately African American, Latino, Native. And so as we approach it, it's absolutely critical that people from those communities be in leadership positions, that the policies start with them, so that, in fact, if you get that right, we'll get climate right. And in fact, that is, I've been working on this for a long time. I've always known that the media got this wrong. The media has always tried to portray American environmentalists as well-educated white people. But if you actually go travel the United States, talk to people, see where people's hearts are, actually, and the poll numbers support this, Madison, Latinos are incredible environmentalists off the charts. African Americans are disproportionately environmentalists off the charts. Asian Americans, it's not what the media would have you believe. This is a grassroots-driven environmental justice motivated movement. It has to be. That's what's appropriate. That is in 2020, and it's been true forever. That is how we should think about environmentalism. That it's a human-driven thing, that we have to be just about it, that it will create millions and millions of good-paying union jobs. And so as we solve a climate problem, we're dealing with associated, connected problems of employment and justice that everybody is feeling and that are, broad-based in our society.
Tom, you mentioned the economic impact of working towards a safer planet for all of us. I'm wondering, if you were to talk to a CEO and try to convince them that being environmentally friendly would help their bottom line, what would you say?
I would say anyone who thinks that we have to choose between the natural world and a strong economy doesn't know what they're talking about. We did a study, At this point, it's 5 to 10 years ago, with CEOs from across America, with Republicans, with independents to say, acting on climate, addressing climate fundamentally will create more jobs, faster growth, better payment, in addition to dealing with our health problems and our environmental problems. So anyone who's on the other side of this, Madison, is either ignorant or lying. This is a huge positive for American workers and American businesses. And anyone who's on the other side is making up facts for their own sake. There's no question here that whether this is good for the country. The issue here is to make sure, which Joe Biden really does, is that when we think about this, we don't just create these millions of jobs, but we make sure that they're good paying, middle class union jobs, and that we are thinking about every single worker in declining industries and making sure that we're respecting their dignity, their right to provide for their families, that we take that responsibility absolutely seriously. And that's one great thing about the vice president is everybody knows he cares about working people and working families, and he would never abandon them.
And you're on Biden's environmental or climate advisory council, rather. Are there any upcoming changes to his climate action plan that you can give us a sneak peek into, or any conversations you had with him on that?
Let me say this. There aren't, but he has a fantastic plan that he and his campaign and other activists worked on for months. And it really, I think you look at $2 trillion being spent in the first 4 years, 100% clean electricity by 2035, net carbon neutral by 2050 economy-wide. Joe Biden has a very progressive, aggressive plan. And the other thing that we have to remember, Madison, is this. Only 15% of the greenhouse gas emissions come from the United States. This is a global problem. Yes, we have to acknowledge the problem, which our existing president refuses to do. Yes, we have to deal with our own situation and have the kind of progressive plan that Joe Biden has proposed. But more than that, we have to have the credibility around the world to get the 85% of the greenhouse gases emitted by the people outside the United States and lead a coalition to solve a global problem. And, obviously this president doesn't meet any of those hurdles. And Joe Biden has a long history of international experience, relationships, and really can get that done. That's what actually has to happen for us to succeed here. We have to come together as a world, because if the United States is perfect and the rest of the world goes along its merry way, we don't solve anything.
And Tom, you've been raising the alarm on this issue for a long time. Is this moment different in your eyes at all?
Well, we don't know yet, Madison. In all sincerity, I will say this. I started the largest youth voter mobilization effort 8 years ago, NextGen America, in American history. I know the people in your generation, the 18 to 35-year-olds, absolutely understand that your future is inextricably tied to climate action. That if we don't have the kind of urgent, progressive action that I'm talking about and that Vice President Biden is proposing, that your future is changed vastly for the worse. And so in terms of, is this moment different? You guys already got it. There's no doubt in my mind. I do believe that watching these fires across the West Coast, record numbers of cyclones in the Gulf, a hurricane hitting Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, climate is not a West Coast problem. It's an all 50 states problem. And so do I think people are getting this? I think they've been getting it. I think now people are realizing this isn't next generation's problem. This isn't tomorrow's problem. This is an urgent problem that we absolutely have to address right now. The only good news I can say is we have the tech to do it. We've got the know-how. Americans are really doing a great job on research. We have an ability to change our political system in less than 7 weeks, that is probably the single most critical thing we can do to save the planet. So it's in our hands. And I think Americans are smart. That's what I've learned in 10 years. Americans are smart. They're decent and compassionate. We're brave. We can do this. We have to choose to do it together. And I think this will be the biggest accomplishment, in the way that I described, creating jobs along with a justice program that we can ever do.
And you mentioned your nonprofit, NextGen. NextGen's own polling shows that a lot of young people are unsure about how to vote, particularly during COVID. So I'm curious, do you feel that young people that Biden can count on young people to really get out and vote?
Well, let me say this. I would never say count on, Madison, because this is an issue. I think every person who's in the running for president, like Joe Biden, can't count on people, has got to reach out. And I believe he is, in this climate program, he is really reaching out to young people. And I believe, from what I can see at NextGen and what I can see in the primaries leading up to really today, is that your generation, the 18 to 35-year-olds in this country, in my mind, I am optimistic, will vote at historic levels. More of them will vote than have ever voted in history. That your generation, absolutely the biggest, most diverse generation in American history, has the ability to take control of this situation, has the ability to lead. And I believe that will happen on November 3rd. And I believe that you guys will sweep in a transformative new government across the board. And that it really will be, of course, it's not all about climate, but that is an absolutely critical part of it. We saw that in the Massachusetts primary, where a climate champion, Ed Markey, turned out more than twice as many people as usually show up in a Democratic primary there. And so we're seeing real evidence that young people are responding. They're responding to Joe Biden. And I really believe it's a do or die moment, Madison. And I believe that as Americans, we're going to do.
Tom, you've used the word optimistic several times, which is fascinating to me in this conversation about climate change. And I'm wondering if for folks who just feel like climate change is such a big problem, they don't have any ability to make things better. What's your message to them? What makes you hopeful right now?
Well, we do have the tech. It's unquestionable that we're ahead of where anyone thought we would be in terms of clean energy and the ability to transform our economy. And we do have the ability to transform our political system if we all show up. So the number one thing people can do right now is commit to vote and to get all of their friends and relatives to vote. Because I'm a huge believer in the wisdom of the American people. And so the reason I started NextGen America was to say this: if the largest generation in American history is voting at half the rate of other American citizens, is that a true representative democracy? No, it isn't. We need young people to show up and their voices to be heard. The power in that combined voice is world-changing, absolutely world-changing. And so if we show up on November 3rd as a people and demand that our government do the right thing, then we're going to get that. And I'm very optimistic. I believe in the American people. I believe young people are going to show up. I believe we're going to see a transformational, generational change. And that we're going to then have the ability, in terms of the moral right, the technological capability, and the political, prowess to get this done. And, short of that, the news from the natural world, if you're living in California, if you're living in, the southeast of the United States, if you're following the science, which I do somewhat obsessively, then we're in crisis. But all that says is, okay, we need to rise and meet the challenge. That's not the first time Americans have heard that. We need to rise and meet the challenge. So let's just go do it.
And you're also co-chairing Governor Newsom's Economic Recovery Task Force in California. I'm wondering what your plan looks like to help Californians recover, not only from losses from coronavirus, but also financial losses related to these fires now. Well,
the governor, in my mind, exactly correctly has been saying for us to get the most robust recovery, we first have to get the health situation under control. And if you're following that, the numbers on the health situation have continued to get better and better. What we've said from the very beginning of our task force is this. Yes, we want to come back in terms of jobs, employment, and growth as strongly as possible, but we want to do it in a just and equitable fashion. So we have a huge premium on equality, and we have a huge premium on doing it in a sustainable, green, clean energy fashion. So when we look about coming back, we know we're going to have to rebuild this state. I think we have to realize that we can't rebuild what we had. What we need to rebuild is something that takes into account what you just asked about earlier, Madison, which is the inequities of how people are suffering in terms of the virus, the inequities that exist, systemic inequities that existed before, racial, environmental, and economic. And we have to rebuild something that's sustainable. We can't be building a state or a country that is going to, have the guts in it that ensure we continue on this same unsustainable climate path. We've got to do it in a way that really is, works with the Biden plan in terms of, yes, being sustainable and dealing with the climate, yes, creating those jobs and dealing with the environmental injustice that have existed really for as long as we've been around.
And when talking about environmental injustice, you mentioned the importance of really speaking to people in these communities and hearing from them about how it impacts them. Have you advised former Vice President Biden on any individuals who might provide good insight into the handling of environmental injustice?
I have over the last decade plus met some of the most impressive environmental justice leaders across the country. And the ones I first met were politically within my home state of California, where the environmental movement and the legislation in the last 10 years has been led by legislators like Eduardo Garcia from some of the poorest districts in California. So yes, I've tried to make sure that the people that I've met along the way, the people who have been living environmental injustice their whole life and then leading in their communities against it. So yes, I've tried to make sure that the Harold Mitchells, who's a guy from South Carolina whose family grew up next to a toxic plant, parents were sickened, he was sickened, has been a leader in that community now for decades. Tried to make sure that people in the Biden campaign got the opportunity to meet some of these leaders so that they can get the wisdom. And let me say this, the vice president has always, this is just in his wheelhouse, caring about people getting poisoned. If you know Joe Biden, you know that he immediately, viscerally responds to an injustice done to the most vulnerable. And the other thing that's true about this is, like I described just two people out of a number, and I hate leaving anyone out. Those just happen to be two people who've done amazing work, but there are a lot of other ones, including, may I say, in New York City. But what you realize is they have real wisdom on these topics that is deep. They also have, real wisdom about life. Do they get climate? Yes, they get the science and climate. There's no question about it. But they can put it in a context that's rich and deep. And let me say one last thing about this, Madison, in terms of connecting the Biden campaign. We haven't done it recently, but we used to go to the most toxic, most polluted zip code in every state we were in, just to see what it was like. And let me say, we almost always met when we had those meetings in church basements. They were uniformly communities of color. And someone on our team would always have to be excused from the meeting to go into the bathroom and cry. So when you see this going on, when you see communities where the life expectancy is 20 plus years lower than their neighboring communities, when you see people and they point to their family and they say dead, 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 dead in their 50s, when you see people really dealing with toxins, pollutants over an extended period of time, it's heartbreaking. It's absolutely I mean, there's nothing sadder than seeing people poisoned and killed systematically through a community. And so, when I talk about environmental injustice, people use words like pollution and, very kind of scientific academic words. It's poison. It's human beings suffering. It's young kids lying in their bed in pain, not able to go to school, maybe not able to live out their lives. That's what we're talking about.
Tom, I hate to make things short here, but I believe you have an important phone call to get to. So I'm going to ask you one quick final question. We've seen with some of these stay-at-home orders some positive impacts on the climate. Do you think that any of the changes we've implemented to combat COVID-19 should be continued in an effort to keep our planet safe?
Well, let me say this. I mean, I think the big thing that's happened in terms of the change in behavior has been the explosion of activity that's moved from the physical world to the virtual world. So, for instance, the number of doctor's appointments that are done virtually has gone up 10 times. The amount of people who work from home has exploded. Now, are those things that are going to solve our problem long term? I honestly don't think so, Madison. I think for us to deal with this problem in the way that we need federal action along the lines of the Biden plan. Does the explosion of the virtual world help? It helps, but we've got a much deeper problem than that. We've got an infrastructure across the country that needs to be rebuilt. We need to weatherize and fix up commercial buildings and houses across this country. We have to get around in clean transportation. This is a really rebuilding of America in a clean, sustainable fashion that we have to accomplish together. We have to agree that it's necessary. We have to do it in a way that makes our economy and our working people stronger and better off. And we have to do it in a just way that takes into account historic, systemic, environmental, and racial injustice. But we can do that. And I truly believe that if we show up at the polls and elect Joe Biden and flip the Senate and get in a new transformative progressive government, that we are going to do it, and we absolutely have to do it. I mean, the story to me of these fires and these storms back east and what's going on at the poles in terms of the melting of the glaciers is we have to do it now. We have, people say, how long do we have to do this? And the answer is no time. We don't have a choice. We don't have a minute to waste. We can't lose this election. Everybody has to show up, and we've got to accomplish this together, or it's not going to happen.
Tom Steyer, we can't thank you enough for your time today. For those of you watching, please continue to follow Bloomberg QuickTake wherever you get your news on all social platforms. And again, Mr. Steyer, thank you so much for your time.
Madison, it's such a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you so much.